As everyone knows, Keith is the main force behind the SDK, wrote most of it himself, working with Elise to get the calculations in an easily accessible manner in an SDK that the front end can then consume and make use of and create our wonderful product. Keith is going to give an overview of the architecture, how to develop in the SDK, and I guess things to think about as you're doing so. I'll turn it over to Keith and have at it.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. All right. I thought I'd start off. I'm just going to show a couple of charts this is from the hackathon presentation that we gave some time ago. But I wanted to point out a couple of things from it just to start off at a high level. When we started thinking about the SDK, we wanted to make it, not that, wanted to make it usable by any UI, not that anyone is going to necessarily create another UI very similar, at least to what the very nice one we have now. But we definitely wanted it to be, we wanted to push as much logic down into the SDK as possible so that for use cases like the CI/CD pipeline, for really any other automated use cases, then it would be easy to have all of as much of the functionality as possible there. So that was one of the kind of design principles. Some other design principles were to use TypeScript to make it easily embed into single page apps. Also, you'll notice, I'll show you in just a second, that the code in the SDK is really structured very similarly to what's on the glass in the UI. So the the mapping should be relatively easy to go back and forth between it. I already mentioned we wanted to push the SDK down in the logic. Also, another design principle was how things are the relationships between various things within the system. We've got obviously the well-known top-level design system, which then contains atoms, molecules, organisms, and it also, those are the three that we mainly think of. And here you follow the tree. This is a dependency graph or tree in this case. It is more generally a graph, as I'll talk about later. But so this is a one-to-one. There's a group of atoms, and then you have multiple atoms like the color palette atom, et cetera. And then molecules and organisms. And then the layers are these accessibility layers that we are able to select in the UI. And then code generation is also a node in the tree where we have both the CSS and the JSON code generator today. So at a high level, now the reason I said that it's a dependency graph rather than just a tree is because there's a relationship between, we want to be able to say, for example, don't enable, let's say we're in the color themes. In the UI, we want to be able to easily say what things should be disabled or enabled when. And so for as an example, as you think about if we let's go to the UI, it's always good to look at it. And let's create a design system. And here you can see in the UI, this maps to a node in that tree I was talking about. This is an atom color palette, but notice that color theme and subcut, all these are disabled. That happens as a result of this generic calls based upon dependency relationships that we have between various nodes in this tree. And in this case, go back to this, the color theme has a dependence upon the color palette being initialized. And if it's not initialized, then it's not enabled. So there are two properties for every node in this tree that we have here. And the two properties are, is it initialized? And we say it is initialized if all the child required properties that have no default value have been initialized. And then is it enabled? That is, in the UI, is that associated node enabled and or is it grayed out at that time? And it's enabled if all of the dependent nodes are initialized. And we can create a dependency that is not just tree based, but graph based. So we can go from one atom to say this atom depends upon another atom. And that's now you really have a more generic directed acyclic graph rather than just a strict tree data structure. Okay. Any questions about just the general high level or I'll talk about we have things called so we have something called a node and a property that I'll wait until we properties can be thought of as leaves of the tree. They cannot have children, but these nodes in the tree can have children. Like an the atoms node in the tree has a bunch of atoms as children, and then each. But we can actually can have properties associated with. In fact, we do have properties up here at the design system level. I know this picture doesn't show that, but properties are associated with design systems, with the atoms, that is the collection of atoms, collection of molecules. It can be at each node in the tree. And that's important not only now, but even more so going forward with the future of the product, because having this dependency graph is really important to be able to know how who to notify when. If we update one property, what does that influence and what does it affect? And this dependency relationship helps us to figure that out. Okay. If there are no at any point in here, please stop me and ask questions. Because if you're thinking it, somebody else is thinking it. So at the top level, let me first of all say here, I'm in the SDK at the top level. Let me just collapse everything so you can see. We've got docs, which are automatically generated API docs, the source, which we'll go into, some tests, which are we have test and test. These are Jest based, if you're familiar with Jest as a TypeScript framework or JavaScript framework for test and for unit tests, it is. I think some work could be done to actually move. This is just an ad hoc, um, general high level test that is one file. It's not using any framework, but this could certainly be moved into a specific Jest test, but it's still there separately for now. At a high level, we've got the dev guide, which I'll walk through, and we have, the tutorial. So just want you to be aware that these are for developers, obviously, both of these really, and available for you to go through and we'll look at in a second. But let me, again, go down to the top level code structure just so you see what is here. At the top is the design system object. At the very top is the theme builder, right? So this is a singleton instance that we create. We can, for every design system created, that's the object there. And then design systems then contain atoms, molecules, organisms, code, and layers. Those are the things that I just showed you in that picture. And just by the way, you can find the same thing that I went through. Let me show you where it is checked into the code. This is the lowest level node object in that dependency tree. And if you open this up at the top here, I have the same comments that were on that slide that I just showed you. And it gives the same, tells you about what it means to be initialized versus enabled, those two states. And the properties object, the property is, you can see here, the base level property extends node. So it is itself a node, but it can't have, but we don't really effectively you could, I'm not sure that I prevent it, but it's really a leaf of the tree always. Um,
Keith, Keith, can I interrupt you for just a
yeah,
second?
yeah, sure, Cody.
Sorry, I had a high level question, and I probably should ask this about 5 minutes ago, but I'm always curious about integrating the theme that we build into other projects. And my understanding today is that we have a layer. I realize this isn't part of the SDK, it's probably part of the front end part of it, but there's a layer that's mapping the theme to a material UI. I guess we're mapping the theme generated by the theme builder to a material UI theme that can be consumed by material UI, if I'm not mistaken. I just wanted to confirm that's the case, that if I wanted to use this technology on another project, I would be best off, trying to replicate that mapping between the theme builder and material UI. Or if we wanted to use a different component library, to be rebuilding what's already been made to map this to material UI. Are my assumptions on the right track with that?
Yeah, that is correct. A lot of the things that when Lease designed this at a high level, they do map to material UI concepts, and they will continue to in the future.
Yeah.
So, with regard to doing it in other use cases, I don't think necessarily that if it's another use case, you can't use our UI also, because we're trying to make it as where that you can export things. But again, by definition of it being a UI, it's not, you can't put it into a CI/CD pipeline to do that. In that case,
Right.
then, yeah, but to your higher level question, yeah, they do map the
Okay.
material. Did that
Yeah. I think you're confirming what I understand. And the easiest path for me to use this technology in another project, use material UI and borrow that mapping that we already have on the front end.
correct? Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Thanks for that. Sorry to pull you off track. You're on a roll. Sorry.
No problem. I do wanna point out these 2, documents that I mentioned that are checked in. I showed you there's a developer's guide that shows you how to to build it in PM run build, pretty simple. To run the test, there are 2 sets of tests that I've talked about. There's the ad hoc one, run do test, and then run test for the jest-based ones. Again, they could be collapsed into just jest if we want to in the future. This gives you the code layout that I've already gone through. I guess I didn't mention, I haven't gone through as much, and I'll go into more detail about the shade class for sure. I will say shade is a very important class. That's where the majority of calculations are. That's not completely, they're down in common at least. And we are currently in the process, and let me show you, of as part of issue 501, we're restructuring some of this, and we're introducing a new class that is not even checked in yet, called a shade builder. And, but it will be in soon. And so I'll go ahead and mention what this does at a high level. In order to build shades, there are various configuration items that need to be provided to build shades, at least more so going in the future after 501. And there are these properties. Remember, I talked about nodes have properties. Here's an example of how you see that actually in the code, is that this is a group of, we have the WCAG level, which is AA, AAA, and that's a property string selectable that you can see here, where I instantiate it as a WCAG level. This says it's a required property, so it's true or false, required or not. I give the selectable values, which are AA, AAA, and the default values AA. So this is how you instantiate like a string selectable. Now, a string, obviously, sorry for the hover overs here. I'll try to stop doing that. The light text and the dark text light mode, these are required also for if you go into the logic and say, oh, we're generating a group of shades. And let me back up. I think I realized I'm just not, I want to make sure it's clear to you what I mean by generating shades. So let's go to the UI. And here we're going into color palette. This is, and I'm going to add a color one, right? Probably everybody knows this well. And as soon as I add a color, this is what I'm talking about by generating shades. These are all the light mode shades and the dark mode shades. Obviously, we know one variable that affects the generation of shades is whether it's light mode or dark mode. But there are other variables, and that's what I was getting to here. Yeah, and so this is going to be whether or not it's what the light text and the dark text properties currently are, and light mode and dark mode text opacity. These are, notice I say per design system. So that's the granularity of those configuration items. Oops, excuse me. There's a couple of other configuration items when generating shades that need to be on a per color basis, so they're more granular. And that's the light mode and dark mode max chroma values. And so that's a collection of this. I created these objects just so they would be co-resident with the shade builder class, which is down here. You can see that so when we create this class, shade builder, to obviously build shades, which is what we did in the UI just now, it takes a design system configuration object and a one that's per color, a color config. And it also takes whether or not it's light mode or dark mode. So that in itself, encompasses all the variables that we required to know when generating shades. Okay, let's go back to that again. The top level shade object here has a lot of computations on it where we're calculating the luminance value, perceived lightness, etc. You can look through here and see this is a fairly large class. And we try to deal with just the shade objects because from a shade object, you can get, sorry for, again, the scrolling, but let me get to the top here you can see how many, we have the hex value of a shade, RGB array value, the RGB separately. We have an ID for the shade, which is really the path that may or may not be, it can be unknown as you can see here, but it can be also the path in that dependency tree to this shade, how it was built. We got opacities, anyway, lots of different things for shades. All right, now let's go back to this little dev guide here. So that's, again, the code layout, lots of stuff in common, lots of computations. We have a couple of directories, let's see, or at least one, the storage. This is really just, we need persistent storage, the SDK does, to store away the themes. And this is just an abstraction to that. The SDK itself has an implementation, so you can see it's a very simple interface to implement for storage. Get, set, delete, list keys, and list metadata. And you can see that we have by default, there's just an in-memory storage that is shipped, but obviously the theme builder app is part of the UI. It is the one that connects to the database. So it passes down an implementation of this interface. Okay, let's go back to the getting started here. Okay, the SDK has been designed to try to make it I know there are obviously a class of changes that we know we need to make over time that are very common tasks. Uh, and that's what this section really talks about is how to extend the SDK for those. Obviously, there are other things that may require more intrusive things, but a very common task would be how to add a property to an atom, molecule, or organism. Or let's see, or sometimes I think another one that's not even on here, that's even simpler than this, would be changing the default value of one of the properties. And that simply means you just have to go to where it's instantiated, that property is instantiated, and we hard code a default value for it at that point. That is the ones that have default values. Obviously, properties don't have to have it, and they can be required to have a value before they're initialized, or they don't have to have a value at all. So here is an example of of one that is just a property string. So it's not something that you have a selectable associated with. You can see it's not a required property, but it does have a default value. It's always going to have a value because default foo is the value. When when adding the one thing we talked about, the persistence when we write things out to the storage. The deserialize and the serialized methods are obviously used when we need to persistently store it. And so whenever you add a new atom or add a property to an atom or molecule or organism or anywhere else in the tree or a design system, then you need to look at deserialized and serialized objects and make sure that that you follow the same pattern and that you're doing that, because obviously if you forget to do that, then it's not going to be persistent. As soon as you store it and then reload it, it's going to work. You're going to think it works until you close the design system and then reload it, and then your values are gone. So this gives an example of adding this example is an atom, but really molecule or organism or anything else, it follows exactly the same pattern. Yes, and this just gives you step-by-step instructions on how you can do that. Now, adding a new code generators, let me go to the code generators just to give you a little bit of a flavor, because code generation there are two code generators, as we know, there's CSS and JSON. And by far, this CSS generator is much more complex than the JSON generator. And the reason for that, if you go in here, sorry, let's minimize that so I can see. Even if you just look at this, is still a pretty large bit of code, but it's really boilerplate type stuff. It's very simple in terms of you have it follows the same design of atoms, molecules, organisms. I think looking at the code, it will be very clear to you what it's doing is here at the top level, get the JSON base, get it this is one that gets it for both. Yeah, sorry. This is the JSON base are the JSON variables that don't depend upon being light mode or dark mode. There are variables in here that depend upon light mode or dark mode, and that's what these are for. So, and which call the base level get JSON with a light mode parameter. But all of them just return JSON, and it's very easy to follow the code here. If we go to CSS generator, let me scroll to the top here. At a high level, you can follow the atoms, molecules, organisms section, but the reason that it's much more complicated is because we have to dynamically notify when a variable changes, we have to know what things in the system need to be regenerated. For example, if we change something, and let's say you're in the UI, let's go back. to the UI, and let me go ahead and so now the color theme is generated here, and we'll have to go through. Let me go through. I guess I could just load and initiate already. Sample. I think it's already loaded, right? No, it's not. Doesn't have a color theme. Do either of these? Does anybody know? Is test already? Nope. Test is not generated. Okay, I'll just go back to this one, and I guess I didn't save it. Anyways, just add a single color. I'm not gonna go through and add all the, obviously, in general, you're gonna have at least 3 colors, or most likely. Actually, this is an interesting thing that I'll point out here, is that notice here that based on the from color that we select, if I select on the left side of the spectrum, actually, notice these color shades are divided into 2 segments, and you can tell based upon the color of the text. Here we have black between the 4 and 500 shades. We switch from black text to white text for contrast requirements. And notice here where I say, if I choose 100 here, then I get the 100 through 400 shades. If I choose 500 or later, I'm going to get 500 through 900 shades. And that's important because to meet the gradient requirements for this. But the thing I wanted to point out is that what's happening under the covers here is that we are dynamically notifying this in the color themes. This 2 color has a dynamic listener to say, because the property that is, remember I showed property selectables, right? So this 2 color is a property selectable, but the values that can be selected here are dynamic based upon what I select here. So this property, the property selector value here, has a dynamic listener that's listening to this one so that it can update what should be selected here. I hope that was clear. Anyway, that's one of the examples of a very dynamic requirement here, but that's not the CSS that I was trying to get to. But that was an interesting thing that I thought was worth pointing out as we're going through.
So that listener keep, is that in the UI or is that in the SDK?
That's in the SDK. In fact, if you'd like me, I can here. Let me show you in the code how you would find it. We would go to Atoms, Color Theme, because it's on the color theme. As we were creating the theme, we're initializing and choosing these things. And let's see, the gradient colors. We go to the gradient colors class, and we see the 2. I initially have an empty selectables here, but I create the dependency between, so this is the list, I'm listening on the from. And so notify bind. So this is going to call my notify. Again, apologies for the hover overs. But yeah, this is where I'm adding the dependencies between from and to. And then, so it's going to call as soon as I set. Actually, if we go back to the UI, I think even I've already selected one. I can't go back and unselect a value. But initially, and I'm just going to wave my hands here and say, trust me. But before I actually selected a from value here, this was great. This should have been grayed out. So that happened as a result of this dependency was depending upon it's this line. The to is dependent upon the from. So line 613. And then the listener then to dynamically update it is this notifies call from shade, and it's going to call down through from shade, set selectable values. And this is where I'm actually setting them in that listener. Okay. That was a tangent here. Does that make sense? So I'm trying to get to, again, the CSS generator as to why it's more complicated. And we'd have to go to one of the other atoms now let's just pick minimum target. I think that's maybe the simplest one. But here you notice that there's a CSS. We're showing the CSS here, and we need to, let's see if we pick a different minimum target. It should select a visibility something. Guys, help me remember some of these that have, I guess, the grid settings here as an example. As soon as I change a value on this color change, that's changing. In order to change the CSS that affects this page, there has to be the CSS generator that is generating the CSS has to be notified when either of these settings changes so it can dynamically update that. For the CSS generator, because we're not using CSS, at least currently, I know the future is to have one JSON, have one generator, and then using some other tooling to dynamically generate the CSS. And I will say that when that happens, then you're going to have to make the JSON generator dynamic also, which it's not today because it's a lot more complex. So I don't mean to make it sound like rocket science here. It's just more details. And let me give you an example of the CSS. So this, one of the things that obviously is going to dynamically generate these values every time we change this to not only this CSS, but it's regenerating these values. And in order for it to do that, it's based upon something I call property group listeners. I think that's the name of it. Let me make sure I'm remembering correctly. Let's go to everything property related is in here. Yep. So this property group listener is obviously by definition of what it says, it's a group of properties. And a property can be a member of multiple groups, and there's a group associated with all of these CSS properties that are on this page and that are dependent upon this value. Now, I'm sure if we go to another atom where we've got multiple properties, not just a grid setting, there's like this end-to-end relationship, right, between there are multiple properties on this page that are all in the same property group, and then the CSS code generator is then listening to that any changes of that property group so that it knows to then generate all the CSS variables that are in that group. So that's how the property group listener is, how that's used, how that you should visualize that being used from the UI. So again, back to the CSS generator. See if there's anything else I can say here to there are just lots of places here where we're adding and we're having to just where we're yeah, you can see we're setting the color listener, setting property listeners. If you just search through here for listeners, you'd see that we're listening dynamically for a lot of events. And okay, let's go back to our dev guide. Any questions about code generation in general? The part I said about, was it clear when I was talking about the JSON, if we do away with the CSS generator and we generate our CSS dynamically from the JSON, then hopefully it's clear what I said, that the JSON generator then needs to be made dynamic by adding listeners and et cetera. And then you need to have, rather than a property group listener, should that should translate over to the JSON listener just fine, because you're associating properties generate JSON and properties generate CSS. So the property group listener abstract is going to apply equally to both generators. So you can reuse, that should not have to change, but you just have to go into the JSON generator to add those group listeners and individual property listeners and you could use the CSS generator as a model to do that.
Could you take a second and go through how we would track down an issue where we think a CSS variable should change based on an action and it doesn't? Like, can you show us the code where that happens, where the CSS is generated,
Okay.
or the value of the CSS variable set? Maybe that's what I mean.
Okay, here, let's go. So let's think of really just look for any listener here and you'll see. Okay, here we got one. The default theme. We have a default theme, right? To set. And if the default theme changes, is this what you're looking for? So if, let's say that the bug was, do you want to pick an example or do you want me to choose an example here?
Just something off the top of my head would be, we select the 8 pixel value for the spacing, and for some reason we're not seeing that reflected in the CSS.
Okay, so then let's find, that was the grid.
Yeah.
I would search for grid first. I would see that core system settings here. So let's see, I believe this add property var is going to end up adding, or either that or the VK. One of these is going to add a listener automatically. Yeah. So I have this thing called CSS dynamic variable kind and it set, yeah. So it will set a listener here based upon the number of properties that I pass in here. So in this case, it would be a single property, but it can also handle, let's look for, I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but there are examples here where you can say it depends upon multiple properties and this would handle that case. But yeah, it just sets, if you didn't notice it, then I guess if there were a bug, I would start by just searching for something. This would be your launching point. It's coming to CSS generator, searching for this and seeing where is a listener, or is there a listener registered And maybe it's not, and that's the problem. But for the grid settings case that you just gave me, then I would see that, yeah, I would just follow the path down here, and then I would see, oh, it's trying to register a listener because it's trying to do it does it as a CSS dynamic variable. So I would first go through and look at the code to see, does it look like it's even registering a listener? And if I and in this case, I would see, oh, yes, it is. Then it's not calling this callback. You could even come in and put some extra debug if you needed to say, what is this is the single prop call. I don't think you need that because it's going to call this callback. So you could, looks like there's no real debug here, but you may want to add debug just to temporarily, at least to see, is this method even being called? Is that enough to tell you, or are you looking for more, Aaron?
No, I think that's fine. You're showing in the CSS generator where the CSS variable is set. So that's what I was going for.
And then one other thing I would add is that we have this listener that is listening for it. And let's say, so the flow of this, maybe what would be helpful here is for me to speak through all the way through the flow of how it goes from the change to notifying something one of the UI listeners, or the in this case, yeah, it's notifying obviously the CSS generator. But anyway, you see here that it would come through the property set listener, it would bind, it would end up calling this single prop callback. And if there's a if this object has a callback on it, otherwise it's just going to set the value. And honestly, I don't remember off the top of my head the cases. I would have to revisit the case where where we want this to be. Seems like we would always want to set the value here. Off the top of my head, I don't remember why this is an else, to be honest. But we definitely want to do a callback if there's one associated with it. And that's an option, part of the optional parameters that are passed in here. But okay, let's go to the set value. Again, it's been did this a long time ago. And yeah, this is just calling the CSS generator set var, which then, and every time we set a variable, then this is going to look at, for each of the variable groups that are on there, it would then update the CSS vars object on that. And then after it's updated them, then we notify the listeners. And this is just going through all of the CSS var listeners on that, and then calling them back with both the CSS name and the CSS value. I know this is a little cryptic line, but hopefully that's clear. And that's really the end of the flow of notifying. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Yep. So I think I've gone through all of the things, yeah, in this guide, in the developer's guide. There's also this SDK tutorial that goes through a little bit more. Yeah, this may end up being duplicate, but it won't hurt. So this is how, create a theme builder itself. It doesn't have to be a singleton, but most likely you're only going to create one theme builder object. And then you can set your storage for how that theme builder object what it's going to use for persistent storage. You can then create a design system, or you can look up an existing design system or delete a design system. So just basic managing. This goes back again to that the two states of the nodes in the tree, the is enabled, is initialized, and it gives an example of really the same example I think I talked about earlier, and that is the relationship between the color palette and color themes. You can see that color palette, initially, this will be true, no dependencies. Yeah, because it has no dependencies. So it'll be true. And color palette is initialized. It's false because no colors have been added to the color palette yet. Color themes is enabled, is going to initially be false because it depends on the color palette atom, etc. Again, I think I've been through these. I hit these is enabled, is initialized states earlier, but that's examples in the code. Managing the color palette, first part of the design system is that. Yeah, I think this is more of the same. We got this add color, and this, as soon as we add the color, this triggers the build shades for each color that's added. So there's a lot that happens as a result of this call. And just more verbiage around the is initialized, is enabled. Managing a color theme, you can, yeah, create the theme. You can, this is the set default theme if you have multiple themes. Anyway, this is repeating stuff I've already said multiple times about the theme requiring all of these things to be set before it's, yeah, dependency stuff. Managing properties of atoms, molecules, note that. Yeah, I think if anything I said, I think reading through this will help further solidify the things I said about building the tree and the dependencies. And then this section, listening for events, is stuff that I've talked about when we especially talked about the CSS generator. Yeah, and there are event types that I'll go ahead and open this just to let you see there are lots of, ones that start with I clearly are interfaces. I didn't create like interfaces for everything. In general, interfaces were needed to be created for things that are when I needed to basically call up in the tree, like from an atom up to the design system, or because otherwise I'm referencing from the design system down to an atom, I'm referencing the class directly because it doesn't create the circular dependency. And here are the event types that I was getting to. So we got node enabled, node disabled, and those again obviously are just a generic node in that dependency graph. Node deleted, and then you got value changed, value deleted, and then a selectables changed, that's an example of when we're talking about the gradients, the from and to. This would have been an event that was fired from that. Okay, it is. Let's see. Let me go back. I'm looking at the time here, and I know we're at the end of our scheduled time. This is more generating code, which is getting a snapshot of the CSS variables. You can do it through that call, or getting dynamically notified is through the set CSS var listener. And yeah, this is again getting snapshots only of JSON because it's not dynamic currently. Okay, I'm going to stop there and just ask for questions. I'm happy to entertain any other questions. This WCAG I will say the WCAG object is something new because it wasn't in there before as part of the issue 501 that should be going in soon. Any questions?
So I have a question if no one else does, but I want to let everybody else ask first.
Okay.
No? Okay. So one of the things we're going to have to do for this new design is we're allowing the user to change their default theme after they've already defined it. For example, I could change my primary color from orange to blue, and that's going to impact all kinds of things downstream, which means we're going to need some kind of dependency graph built. But your dependency graph is, if I remember right, based on nodes. Would it be difficult to create one based on colors?
That mm, first of all, so that it is generic. You should not have to. This dependency graph should serve those purposes.
Okay.
It is done. It's a generic. It's not tied to JSON or CSS. So the short answer is no, you don't have to, you don't need another dependency graph. This dependency graph will do that. And in fact, do you remember in part of the presentation earlier where I showed the listener, someone was listening for the default theme changing?
Yes.
That that would trigger as soon as you change the default theme, the dependency it should cause all of the listeners to be notified. Again, the only thing lacking when you go to yeah, right, like right now, or I'm not sure if the UI is even calling the set default theme in the SDK. I don't remember, but if it's not, then obviously that would need to happen. But once you call it, it's going to bubble through the dependency tree and call all of the current listeners. But again, the one thing that's lacking currently is JSON listeners. Let me try to say it in a different way here. The dependency graph that's there, that's using nodes and property objects, is that should not have to change at all. You should the info of what that dependency graph is burned into. For example, again, I'm going to go back to the color theme thing. The fact that, that's the gradient colors, but it's still a equally good example. The fact that this is using the node class, that's just a generic node class that will apply to anything. But so I think the only thing that I know would need to happen for this new design is the fact that you're going from if you're getting rid of CSS generation in the way that we're doing it now. And that's a good thing. I think long term, we're getting rid of the CSS generator, but some of the complexity that's there is going to be we're just going to invest in one code generator, and then you'll have to build through tooling what I forgot what Lee said, how we're going to generate from the from the JSON to the CSS generator. Sorry, I know I'm maybe not being clear here. I think in the UI, you'd have to make the decision. Today, your UI, all of this is using JSON. sorry, all of this is using CSS to display this. So either you are able to rewrite your UI to use JSON, or you have to have generate continue to support the dynamic generation of CSS. But yeah, I'm going to try to paint a picture in your mind here. Let's see if I could draw something. And I guess I could bring up a PowerPoint, but let me just try through words. Today, code generation, if you imagine dependency graph again, that doesn't have to change, it could notify equally the it only has listeners currently in the CSS generator. And the JSON generator is like a parent of code. They're siblings of each other. The CSS generator and the JSON generator are basically siblings in terms of what they're doing. They don't depend on each other in any way. In the future, you're now talking about CSS generation depending upon JSON generation. If you're paint a picture in your mind, I would draw a line from the dependency graph on the left to the JSON generator, which we would now have to have listeners in it that are currently like the ones that are in CSS generator. And then from the JSON generator, you draw a line to the CSS generator, which you're doing through some tooling automatically. So in my mind, there would have to be the work that is needed is first of all making JSON generator dynamic. You could do that by looking at the CSS generator as the pattern that I mentioned earlier. The next thing is, now that we're getting rid of, we're no longer wanting to support this. We want the JSON to be the single source of truth. Then the CSS generator you're going to have a listener, for a dynamic listener for the JSON generator. Now, based upon some group of JSON things that are the same, I think you can still use the property group listener that's generic and that shouldn't change. So your JSON generator can listen to property group listeners just like the CSS generator did. So it's going to say, I depend upon this group of properties. And if any of these changes, then I know I'm using those two. Let's say you got two properties that if either of those changes, they affect the generation value of another property A and B. If either of them changes, property C will change. Then you would have to create a property group listener for regenerating property C based upon property A and B changing. And that would be in your JSON generator. Now, and then the next piece, so now that once JSON generation is dynamic, then you got to say, okay, I'm listening to my JSON groups in my CSS generator. So now CSS generator depends upon JSON generator and generating whatever tool. Again, this is part of Lisa's tooling, saying that she's found a way of generating CSS from JSON. But then your CSS generator would then use that tooling based upon listening to JSON generator events, to now generate your CSS. So you're going to have to revamp the CSS generator based upon that tooling thing that knows how to generate CSS from JSON.
Okay.
Okay.
So would you recommend that we make this jump to a dynamic JSON generator before we start putting in
Yes.
these other
Yeah.
changes?
Yes. I would say you could do it. You do the dynamic JSON generator first. And you don't even have to use it. You can just have it sitting there dormant. You've got to have that before you redo your CSS generator using Lisa's tooling stuff or whatever that thing is.
No, what I'm thinking is if we're going to implement this other stuff, the ability to modify a default theme, allowing a user to modify a default theme, could we implement that as is using the CSS generation and then
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, I think actually everything in the I don't know that of anything that has to change in the SDK today to support dynamically setting a default theme. Now, that said, I wouldn't be surprised if you hit a bug where when you set the default theme, then it doesn't maybe I've missed something in one of these add dependencies. Maybe one of those is lacking. But if my first thing that I would do is I would say, if I want to create, I would first in the UI make a call, if you're not already, to say set default theme and do it all from a UI perspective. And then if you see something is not dynamically updating appropriately, then you got to start looking at what isn't being printed in the dependency tree. Hey, I just had a thought actually that would be pretty easy to do, and that is you could actually print out like a human readable version of the dependency graph from by adding a method or so to the node class. And you could go to this node class and you could add a new method, say print tree, and you basically go through here and you say, okay, uh, and then you remember the design system itself is a node, so it extends this class. So then if you go to the design system and say print dependency tree, then it'd be a simple way to actually see what things depend on what. And the thing that you'd print out in your little function called print is you'd say, you've got children, right? And this is the tree part of it. You've got a parent. Obviously, everybody's going to have a parent except for the theme built or the design system itself. Every design system node is the root of the tree. And then, so my print would walk down through all the children recursively, and it would print. I think you really only need to print the dependencies. You can, if you wanted to do it to say, oh, this depends upon this, you could do both. Yeah, you could print out, but in that way, you could just look at the information. Each of these nodes has a name. As long as you printed it out hierarchically in your little print method, then it'd be an easy way to see it. Anyway, I think that would be a very useful thing to add.
Yeah.
And that would make it really easy to debug. Let's say if in your case where you're adding your theme builder, sorry, you're setting the default theme builder and say it doesn't, then trigger some events, as you say. The very first thing you could do is you could print this thing out and say, is there even a dependency there? And if it's not, then you just have to go in and make that one of those calls, add, I forgot what it's called now, add dependency or let's see. Yeah, add dependency. So the add dependency call, obviously, it adds both the thing to dependencies as well as it goes to the dependency and adds dependence. So it does both. that one call. Yeah, you can see it here.
Are dependencies like, or dependence like, can a child reference its parents' dependencies? Is it like up the tree or no?
No, these are the dependents are the children are the relationship that are tree based. Like when you go to the UI
Mhm.
and under atoms is a node, color palette is a child of atoms, color theme is a child of atoms. However, and that's just a tree. It has no when in a tree where you have, and I'm going to node here, you can't reference a sibling that's in a true tree.
Yeah, but but I'm saying to a parent in this case, like a child referencing a parent. In
Yeah.
this case, is it referencing dependencies from the
No, the dependent when you say when it adds a child, I don't know it doesn't I don't think let's look at the constructor. Because I pass in a parent. No, I added as a child,
so this doesn't have
but
any
it
dependencies?
does not affect dependencies. It doesn't mean now I still use that. Remember the definition, and let's go back to
Inside
the
of your inside your parent is an I node, and where's parent defined in this case? Parent, and it doesn't have dependencies because dependencies are technically a definition of your object here.
dependencies is a variable. They're all type node.
So when you're constructing it and you say this parent is equal to like the input, and then you're setting the child equal to, you shouldn't have parent dependencies.
No, again, if we go back to the definition of each node may depend on inversely depend on it only when all children are initialized. So for me to determine whether or not a node is initialized, I'm recursively walking down all of my children. And that's why it's important that I know my strict children, that I have a tree apart from cross sibling relationships. And so whether something is initialized depends not only upon my dependencies, but it depends upon my children's dependencies. Let me say that again. Whether or not I am initialized, for me to be initialized, first of all, notice in the definition, when all children are initialized. And a property, remember that's the leaf of all of these, is initialized if either it's not a required property or it's required but has a value. So it's really important that I maintain this tree separately from the sibling relationships that you can have generic graph relationships, independence. And again, so to use a specific example, right? You've got atoms. So things can be enabled before things will always be enabled before they're initialized. A node is initialized only when all dependency nodes are initialized. I think, and that's these. So if property A depends upon property B, if I want it, I'm just going to keep it generic. Property A the value of property A depends upon the value of property B, then it's going to be initialized. Sorry. property is a node. So that property is initialized if all dependent nodes are initialized. Sorry, enabled. I'm sorry. It's enabled. So we know to enable it if all dependent nodes are initialized. All right. Why don't do you want to re-ask your question or?
Yeah, no, it was just trying to understand the relationship between parents, children, and dependencies. So it sounds like individually, like whatever node you're at, they may reference individual dependencies at that time, but there's no like codependency from like a child reference like parent's dependency, right? It's not inheriting any attributes from its parent, right? Or vice versa.
Again, by these, I'm not sure what you mean by inheriting, but you can see here that a node is considered initialized only when all children are initialized. So the state of it being initialized does depend upon its children.
Yeah, it's that the relation, like the difference between a parent, child, and a dependency.
Okay. The difference between the parent, child, and dependency is that is really involved in this. It's burned into the definition of when things are considered initialized and when they're enabled, because you have to keep them separate, or else these two states will not be correctly computed of being, and I don't know how else to say it other than they are direct children are different than dependents. And I don't, and a child, just because something is a child doesn't make it a dependent in the definitions here. Okay.
I think I understand. So in the case of you've got your atoms and molecules and things, and your different color palettes. The color palettes will have a dependency, and a color palette will have a theme beneath it, or a theme that would be a child of a palette. Is it true, or is that?
Well, let's just pretend that here you could have the dependency got all of these are initialized. Therefore, the dependents have to be initialized before something is enabled, right? So as long as they are initialized, then they would be enabled. That looks like chart colors. Oh, is that just a heading, or is that?
It hasn't been implemented yet.
Oh, okay. I was wondering why that wasn't. Yeah, but everything currently, I think right now, I think once we have a default theme, I'm not sure if there are any things that are not enabled. It's really just the color palette. To everything really is dependent upon there being a theme or a default theme, and a default theme is dependent upon there being at least one theme, and creating that one theme is dependent upon there being at least one color in the color palette. Yeah, it's all.
Got it. Yeah. In order to, I get it. And so then what is subcolor theme? It's also
Pardon?
work in progress. The subcolor theme.
Yeah, same thing.
Okay. Same thing. Okay. Okay. So I didn't mean to take on a tangent there.
No, I do. Yeah, I think the question, all those are important questions. I think going forward, that the question you ask, Aaron, is really key. And I think, the step-by-step way of making the JSON generator dynamic first would certainly make sense before you even start. Obviously, you have to do that first before you start messing with changing how CSS is generated.
Yep.
All right. Any other questions?
Wow. Thank you, Keith. Very informative.
All right.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Pleasure.